Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this legal compliance session run by Kaizen Synergy Law Firm. My name is Nihal Samara. I'm the General Counsel and Legal Director here at Kaizen Synergy Law Firm, and I'd like to welcome you all to today's session. Today's session follows on from the legal webinar we ran last week covering the new psychosocial laws for charities. Today's session specifically focuses on what I'll call is the legal workflow and give you some of the templates that you need to use within your agency to really help you and support the work that your agency needs to do in order to meet its compliance directions. So let's jump in and have a look at what we are going to be looking at today. So essentially, in summary, what I'm going to cover off is really this flow chart. And we've just tried to graphically represent some of the key things that your agency needs to consider. Now, when we look at the legal work, and I'll work backwards for those agencies that have just joined us today. But when we look at the new psychosocial legal obligations based on the work health and safety, national work health and safety regs, and also dropping down into some of the government and regulator reporting requirements, there is this need to get a lot of documents within your agency set up. Now, in a previous lifetime, I'm going to say, it was when I was as a quality and compliance manager working within a not-for-profit agency. There are really a set of key documents that your agency needs to see. So some of that includes, if we work through this, first of all, getting a risk register up. What does that look like? How do you inform your board in terms of what are these psychosocial risks? What impact does it have on my agency? These are the things that you want to be able to show your board of directors, not only what are the risks, what are we doing to address it? The second part of that is on informing staff. Now, I'm going to go through this with you as well too. There is obligations under different regulatory requirements, not just under work health and safety, but also Fair Work, to also inform staff and personnel. Now, we've come up with a legal memo that you can actually use, and that will give you a template in terms of what you need to look at. We've also got these online training that you can access via the Gemba dashboard from last week, being the legal summary of what these psychosocial requirements are, as well as today's session. And so that can be form part of your consultation. So you might use the memo for, say, generally informing your general staff, but also for board members or PCBUs or HSUs as well too, in terms of the engagement of staff in key work health and safety roles. You may need to give them further training as well. Once you've done that, then you need to have a policy document. So what does that then look like? Now, I've divided this up into both a policy and also a code of conduct document. Now, the reason I've done it in that way is because the policy document, and this is not to say that this is the only way to do it, but one of the ways that we're looking at this to make it as easy as possible for you and streamlined as possible for you is to say, right, let's actually have a look at a policy document that meets your obligation and shows what your obligations are as an employer or agency, but also what is the individual staff or personnel obligations, what's their responsibility in all of this. And then obviously what is also the responsibilities of other personnel as well too, whether that be volunteers, members, or contractors that you might engage with as well. So we've got a policy document on that I can show you. The other part is a code of conduct. Now, we've actually taken quite openly the Safe Work document and amended and added and changed some of the information in there. So idea is that you've then got a policy document supported by a code of conduct. And this can be, idea is that it can actually be readily accessible by your agency, and you can literally search and replace and use all these tools as well. Now, the other part of this is on your incident reporting, which is the bottom of your screen. And I'll show you this as well too. So even once you've done all of this stuff that I've shown you above, you can have your policies and code of conducts. You need to be able to monitor the psychosocial risks as well too. But not only monitor, have staff or personnel report if they are involved in this, in terms of how you then provide support, what is the structures that you've then got to put in place to ensure you minimize these and address these incidents as they are occurring. And also, as then part of that, depending on which state and territory you're in. So, for example, in Victoria, you've then got to take these incidents and actually report them to Safe Work as well too. And that's usually, and there's certain reporting requirements that government agencies are now expecting you to do. So from a workflow, last week we covered off the legal overview and your obligations. This week, we're going to look at the documentation that your agency should be having. And as I said, this is a workflow that I'm going to say in a previous life when I was quality and compliance manager many years ago within the not-for-profit sector, essentially these are the core set of documents that I'd be expecting to essentially see. And this is from even a legal point of view as well. Now, obviously, there's some parts of this in terms of subcommittees and working groups and the likes that your agency would also need to set up as well too. And that is something that we're actually going to build upon next week as well too, as part of this webinar series. So in terms of the resources that you have access to, we are going to be sending these out today. That is what we're going to be looking at to walk you through accessing. And I really just want to spend a couple of minutes just so you know exactly where to go to access these resources. You can go to our law firm website to access your portal and simply click on Gemba 360 and that'll bring up this big blue circle. Or you can simply go to gemba360.com. It'll bring up this big blue circle for you and all of you will have access, or if you don't already, have access to this portal as well. So you've got access to this and it'll open up this screen here. Your details will be emailed out to you. Now, the legal resources, let me just show you exactly where these are that I've spoken about. So the first one that I mentioned was, if we just go back to our slides, here we are here. So the first one is the legal memo for your staff or personnel, which we'll cover off. So where is that? So if we just jump in, you'll find that the legal memo is on your notice board. It'll have legal update memo, psychosocial laws. It'll bring up this screen here when you click read more. And when you click the file attachment link, what you'll see is quite simply this screen here, and it'll have the legislative update as well as a summary of all of the specific work health and safety regulations, as well as an overview of what it involves and some of the things that your agency should also be looking at as well. So with it, what I will add is that if you are in certain states like Victoria as well too, where there are additional reporting obligations to Safe Work and the likes and government regulations, then you'll also see a second legal update memo posted there as well. The other one is the learning resources that you also have access to, the online webinars. That includes today's session as well. Simply click on the Gemba College and that will open up this screen here. And you can have a look at the psychosocial laws and agency obligations. And if you click on that link there, this will open up your second set of resources, which will include the online training videos that we have around the compliance obligations. And as I mentioned, this includes today's session. Now, with that being said, what we have as part of this for you as well, and this is often used for agencies in terms of their representatives. Here we are here, overview of the legal obligations from last week, and also today's part 2 session that you can see down the bottom. The other couple of things that you've also got, which is on the policy templates, and I know a few people have chomping at the bit to access these. You do have the Gemba docs. And if we go into legal templates, you can see the psychosocial, and you've got the code of conduct and the policy documents that I'm about to go through today. And these are all edited Word documents. So clicking on the policy document, for example, will actually bring up this document here. And it is simply a Word document that you can simply go to. And I'll discuss that shortly. The other one is the psychosocial code of conduct document as well. And if I bring this up here and click on that, then again, you've got access to that, which is managing psychosocial hazards. And we've gone through, and this is, as I said, a template that we've actually found with Safe Work. And we acknowledge the work that Safe Work has done on this. And again, looking at a code of practice document that your agency can also utilize as well too in terms of its resources. The last two things that I will cover off that you have access to is the risk register and also the incident reporting form. And you can see those down the bottom. Now, the incident, if I just start with the incident form, after someone has identified a psychosocial risk, essentially you will need an incident form to record and show how your agency is managing and mitigating that risk. So what we have is the notification of incident form. Clicking on that will bring up this screen here for you. And these are all resources that your agency does have access to. So this is a standard incident form that you have. And you can see here what we have included is based on the legal obligations under the model WHS regulations, and also including things: has debriefing occurred? Does this involve a psychosocial risk? And identifying 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 being the identified psychosocial risks that your agency needs to look at. Looking at a workflow that you have access to in terms of how do you put structures in place, which I will come to in today's session, and also what is your plan to prevent reoccurrence of this incident as well. So by using this, you can then pull off the reports. Again, if you're needing to make submissions directly to Safe Work or other government regulators, and you can select who you're actually going to do it by and how and when you're essentially going to manage these particular requirements moving forwards and set the dates. And again, all this can be audited. The last thing as well too is the risk register, as I pointed out. And the risk register, if I click on this, is a full organizational wide risk register. There may be some questions on what is the difference between an incident report versus a risk register, but essentially this is how your corporate governance requirements in terms of how you manage your organizational risks within your agency. And we've got an entry here on psychosocial hazards as well. So let's run through these items for you and look at what your obligations are in terms of the legal workflows. So essentially, when we look at the risk management, there are a range of specific reporting requirements that your agency needs to look at. This is found, as I pointed out last week, in the model work health and safety regulations. Risk management is essentially looking at identifying in the workplace inspections, consultations with government regulators and reports, and identifying the hazards and risks and looking at what control measures are implemented, as well as periodic reviews of the risks. So essentially looking at your risk register is going to drive what you need to look at. So when we look at the work health and safety regulations, model regulations, and legal changes across Australia, essentially step one of this is on, well, updating your organizational risk register. So when we look at this, and let me just jump back onto our dashboard here. And as I said, this is stuff that you all have access to. So essentially, we've got the template in here. You can click on the risk register. And when we click on edit on the top right-hand corner, what we're looking at here is it's a risk management process. The risk and potential impact is on psychosocial hazards. It is under people and safety. And what we've done is implement policies and procedures to manage psychosocial risks. Taking the information directly from the regulations is looking at your current controls and saying, right, this is the steps that we're going to take in terms of minimizing our psychosocial risks. And essentially identifying, and what you'll see is that we've put in today's date. We're looking at reviewing this next week with you. And then in 2 weeks' time, we're going to revisit this again in terms of what your agency needs to look at. And this is when we look at further works on things like board reports for psychosocial risks, and also your subcommittees or working groups that you may need to form as well too. And when I talk of this is what we're finding in policy documents released by various state governments and also regulators. So essentially, this allows you to set up your initial risk reporting and how you're going to go about it. Now, when I go back to my slides, the second thing that we need to really look at is the legal memo for staff. How and what are you going to tell staff in terms of what is this psychosocial risks all about? What is your obligations? What do we need as employers need to consider? Now, what we have put up, as I mentioned, is on your notice board, and I'll just bring this up so you can actually see it, is a legal update on psychosocial risks. Now, from here, you can either print this out or you can also forward this on from agencies. So the idea of this legal update is to give you the broad context and overview of what you're informing staff about. Now, in some states, these legal changes have occurred. In Victoria, because it's not part of the model rules, there are regulations that are moving through Parliament as we speak. So this being said, there are new requirements under work health and safety laws that require organisations to manage and protect a worker's psychosocial health. And that is reality of what your obligations are. Now, when we look at this, and this is where I'm going to say I flip my hat between lawyer, but also working within your agencies as a quality and compliance officer. Now, from a legal point, absolutely, employers need to be across the work health and safety obligations. But from a quality and compliance officer's perspective, like many of you have, it should also be acknowledged that most jobs involve some sort of psychosocial hazards. Now, with that, it means then that as part of that, hazards are defined as things that can harm a worker's mental health. This doesn't mean things like your performance reviews that you do. And we've all been in situations like that where we've seen it, where all of a sudden there's a spike because people have gone through a performance review and are complaining that they're stressed at work and the likes. And whether you like it or not, these things do happen. But a lot of lawyers won't actually sort of acknowledge that this essentially does occur within agencies. But when you speak to agencies, we know it does. So we need to put that in and say, well, look, we need to be very clear on what psychosocial hazards are. This is not just periodic performance reviews and directions provided by managers. If it's obviously bullying and harassment, absolutely. If there's stress involved in poor organizational change management, as you can see here, but we're going to define what those parameters are. So that way we can put a line in the sand of what the expectations of you as an employer is, but also what personnel can also expect as well too. And what we would say we would reasonably expect, and under the model rules, work health and safety rules, there is this obligation on both employees and employers to take reasonable steps as well. And that needs to be acknowledged in this circumstance. So let's have a look. Your agency obligations. So we've spelt out what we actually covered off last week in terms of what are the types of psychosocial hazards that could lead to reportable incidents. Well, we've listed these here and we've taken them directly from Safe Work for you as well too. Now, once we've got those definitions, what we also look at is the psychosocial regulations, but also what the inspector powers are. So in saying that, there is also an extension to the circumstances for issuing a notice to where an inspector believes that there is a serious risk to the health and safety of a person emanating from immediate or imminent exposure to a hazard as well too. Now, this threshold aligns with the revised language of the proposed notifications of incidents. And so you can start to see when I talk about the specific legal workflow, having memos that go out to staff or having a policy is not going to be enough. You've got to be able to manage an incident or hazard if or when it does arise. Now, and this is things that we will see if an inspector comes in and actually asks you, what have you done? Well, now you've got an incident reporting system to be able to say, right, we've identified the risk, we know when this has happened, and we've identified what steps we've taken. Now, that is crystal ball gazing and pushing that along, but we are still at the memo side of informing personnel about going through this consultation process. The other things that we've looked at is around identifying domestic violence, how workplaces need to make a difference, increase security, what this means in terms of managing emails, phone calls at the workplace as well too. What are some of the mental health workplace strategies in terms of identifying and assessing, as well as things like PTSD, and also identifying stress and what this means for employees now too. Following that, we've also included some recommendations for your agency to take up. Now, once you've done that, essentially there is the requirement under work health and safety to actually consult and engage with staff. Now, with it, you will see that, as I've mentioned previously in other sessions, what is critically important is in terms of identifying what is the specific changes that your agency needs to consider. When we look at this in terms of what are the changes, and let's just quickly revisit these. Well, the changes essentially is that employers need to, as far as reasonably practicable, identify psychosocial hazards. And it is one of those reasonably practicable, it is one of the most tongue-twisting things you'll ever say. And with it, what you will find is that there are psychosocial hazards are defined in proposed regulations to be any factor or factors in work design, systems of work, management of work, carrying out work, personal or work-related interactions that may arise in the working environment and may cause an employee to experience one or more negative psychosocial responses that create risk to their health and safety. Now, this includes all of this, and this is some of the slides that I covered off last week. This is some of the things that the new laws require not-for-profit agencies to essentially follow. And what we've seen is how you're actually going to do this, as well as look at prevention plans as well too. And as I mentioned, in some states, also report these to Safe Work as well too. And there are specific reporting times when these need to be done each calendar year if you are doing it. Now, when I talk of who is looking at you as well, it is not just going to be Safe Work, it is essentially also Fair Work in terms of you consulting with your personnel. It also means that if you fail to do so as well too, then your board members could also be in breach of their obligations as duties of directors. So when we're looking at this, there is a lot of noise that can come from different regulators. And I mean noise on this because it's not as clear as what are your obligations in terms of what you need to meet when you first look at this. So when we do consider this, what we have said as well too, and when I talk of looking at your resources that you need to look at, apart from the risk register and the memo, which I've just shown you, the other parts that you then need to look at is also informing key work personnel within your agency of, well, what are their legal obligations? Now, under the Gemba College, you'll see that we've got, as I mentioned before, the online videos for you to be able to access, and that does include today's session. So with that, you do have the access to the Gemba College side. Here it comes here. And you can then access this in terms of the access for particular work health and safety officers as well, covering off what the legal obligations are, and also in terms of some of the policy templates. So these are the two sessions that we are suggesting that board members do look at as well too, and we will cover that off next week. Now, once you have these in place and you've consulted and gauged people's input and feedback, the other two things that we're going to look at now is the policy and the code of conduct. So let me jump in and I'll just run through essentially what your obligations are. So when we look at essentially what the workplace obligations actually are, you can see that under different states and territories, there are specific legal compliance obligations that you have based on what code of practice, national regulations, and the likes. So with the policy document, and if I go into Gemba Docs, simply click on the Gemba Docs button. I'm going to open up the legal templates and go to psychosocial policy documents. And from here, I'm simply going to click on psychosocial policy. Now, let's have a look at this policy document, and I will make this bigger for yourselves to be able to clearly see on your screen. And here we are here. So if I bring this up, and I'll do this live for you as well too, let's just make this slightly smaller. So here is the template policy. Now, what we have identified here for you is ensuring that your agency, obviously the overarching statements about commitment to the positive mental health, and we have taken this directly out of safe work obligations. What we've also looked at specifically from here, and this is the narrowing of this policy, is to not put too much information in here. And I'll show you why. So essentially this policy purpose is to look at ensuring that your agency, and you can simply search and replace your agency's name in this document, and takes reasonable steps to maintain compliance with the psychosocial hazard obligations. And from here, what we've actually looked at doing is identifying three things. And it's all around specific responsibilities, as you can see here. So the first part is, what is your agency's obligations? The second part is, what is your expected obligations of your personnel? And the third obligation is from other persons, like visitors. So what we're seeing here is identifying what the primary duty of care is for your agency. What is the ability to manage psychosocial risks? And that includes identifying reasonably foreseeable hazards, eliminating where possible the psychosocial risks if it is reasonably practicable to do so, and maintain control measures to ensure they remain effective, and review your control measures. Now, these four items here, 1, 2, 3, 4, covers off your risk register and also your incident register as well too. In terms of what it means for your agency, it means that you need to engage with your HSRs, which is your work health and safety representatives, and also look at sharing relevant information back with workers. It also requires you, as part of this, to then look at, well, what is the obligations on your personnel, like staff? So that means that they do need to take reasonable care for their own psychological and physical health and safety. Obviously, follow your policy documents and also comply with directions where reasonably practicable to do so. And that also covers other persons as well. So we've actually put in the relevant standards and also and you can add in your own psychosocial policies. Now, this policy document you can see, is heavily weighted on obligations. So then you would ask, well, where do I find all my other obligations that I need to follow? And that is listed in the Psychosocial Code of Conduct. Now, when I click on that, as I mentioned, what we have done is build off a lot of the statutory regulator agencies, and we do acknowledge safe work in terms of this document. But what we have done is actually not only pull this document, but also add some further information that specifically focuses on not-for-profit agencies. Now, why I've actually split these documents up into, and why I recommend that your agency splits these documents up into both a policy, and I will just also lie these side by side. The reason that I actually suggest that your agency has these policy documents side by side, and I'm just going to list those too, is that usually within agencies, you have a policy approval process, and obviously sometimes these need to sometimes go to boards, and it's a whole process. So what we generally have, and what I'd recommend for your agency to keep this process moving, is that have your overarching policy that spells out what is your obligations, and then have, I call it a code of conduct, you might call it working procedure document, and you can rename this here with whatever your agency name is, and it'll actually go right through the whole document, and you can see I've highlighted the sections for you. So all of this, the purpose of this is to give you a working document, and this is about all of your obligations that you have within your agency. So it's the key, when I say all, your key compliance obligations that your agency needs to consider. This includes consulting with staff, looking at your psychosocial risk, breaking it down. If anything changes, you can then update this directly from here without actually affecting your policy document itself. It also looks at how do you identify the psychosocial risks and what is the specific requirements that your agency needs to look at. So even down to what are the key areas that your agency needs to consider. Now, within this document, what we have also listed is also what the safe work requirements are, but also looking at both your risk registers and your incident reporting. So the last tool that I wanted to cover off for you is actually your specific requirements under your incident reporting. Now, as you mentioned, and this brings us down to the bottom slide here, which is about your incident reporting. Now, within your policy document, when you go in, and if I just go back to your Gemba dashboard, you can go into this via the risk management section and look at your incident report. Now, from here, what you'll find is that it's a standard incident report. And as part of that, you can bring this up. It'll ask for the general incidents of what's being listed as well too. And also when you get down to the bottom around WorkSafe incident reporting section. So essentially identifying, has debriefing occurred? Does this involve psychological risks? And at the moment, there's 5. Now, I am actually going to suggest, and there's no legal direction on this as yet, but I think that there'll be an extended list coming out within the next 1 to 2 years as part of this process. I think this will be just, and this is just my own personal opinion, but in terms of looking at these specific items, it may also be, for example, with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander agencies or agencies that engage with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander agencies. This might even include lateral violence issues as well too. There's a number of others that we'd expect to see here as well too that can be quite specific as well. Now, once that's being identified, what you need to look at is what is the requirements. So what structures do you have in place? So in this case, I'm going to say that we'll provide staff training. What's the outcome? Increased staff awareness about, let's say, high job demands, okay? Now, essentially what I'm showing here is what is the process that I'm going to follow. Because it is psychosocial risk, we're going to start this tomorrow and essentially get this done by in a couple of weeks' time. Now, what this system will do is actually chase people down for you as well too. So once you've put this information in, it'll actually then send off fire off emails to say, hey, look, this needs to be done. And anything that you do is then audited against the system as well too. So you can actually look at when footprints occurred and when people have actually completed this. We are confident on this, so much so that we know that an agency like Bellarine Community Health actually down in Victoria actually had the other part of this system in place. And with that said, a number of years ago, Safe Work did come out and review their systems and actually ended up giving them the Safe Work Prize for that particular year. That said, the next step that you need to look at is what is the planned action to prevent reoccurrence. And again, you can then document this down. So what this shows you is the ability to actually move from a policy context directly into an incident form managing context as well too. And it's all done on the key set of documents that you need. So from here, you can see you've got the legal update in terms of what you need to inform staff about. You've got the training to support your work health and safety representatives. You've got your board reporting system in terms of what you need to show to your boards in terms of how you're meeting your requirements, and your set of operational documents and incident forms in terms of what you need to meet. Now, as we move through the psychosocial risks for your agency, no doubt there are going to be requirements that your agency does need to meet. We are seeing that the psychosocial risks, when you look at your governance obligations, just to finish off, is now modelled under the Australia's model work health and safety laws, which are made up of the codes of practice published by Safe Work Australia. As part of this, it is the key messages from a legal compliance point of view is that you need to look at that is reasonably practicable to ensure workers and other people in the workplace are not exposed to risks to their psychological health and safety, as well as risks to their physical health and safety as well too. It's going to be your obligation to eliminate, where possible, the psychosocial risks in the workplace, or if that is not reasonably practicable, to minimize these risks so far as reasonably practicable to do so. Now, as I mentioned last week, these are being rolled out progressively around the country. What we are seeing is that there are directions that are being provided in terms of looking at assembling a compliance and implementation team, being familiar with workplace risks as well, and also putting in structures to review policies. So with that said, these are all the directions that you can see are coming out of Safe Work and also the model health and safety rules. Consequently, that's why we have put in these legal resources for you to access and are running these sessions as well. All of these recommendations, as I listed right at the start as well too, is there for yourselves to be able to access these resources. Next week, we will be looking at the working groups and what reports do need to come out of it. So we're going to build off last week, this week, and next week, we're going to be looking at what working groups and teams you need to have in place. I'm going to look at this to make it as efficient as possible for you. So not just create teams for the sake of looking at teams, but what is even the terms of reference that you should be listing to your board members? What are some of the reports in terms of what you need to look at for your reports to your regulators, and who needs to do that as well? As always, more than happy to stay online and answer any questions that you might have. If you are watching this recording after today's live session, then by all means, please reach out to us on 1300 360 360, or you can email us at support@gemba360.com. I also do encourage you, if you are jumping online, to use the chat bar in the bottom left-hand corner. It is there for us to support you on as well too. With that said, we have over 1 million users accessing this system each day as well too. So we are there to support you in your agency as well. So that said, thank you everyone for joining us today. We will stay online and answer any questions that you might have.